What's happening, folks? Back with another reaction, back with some more U2, and we're going to listen to the second of two tracks provided by great friend of the channel, Chris, before we get to the Achtung Baby album proper. And my understanding is this one came from a project worked on by Bono and The Edge related to a stage production of A Clockwork Orange, originally a novel written by Anthony Burgess, though despite this not really being a novel I'm particularly fond of and not enjoying the Kubrick film too much, I've certainly seen it. I get its significance. I respect the dystopian vision, but it's just sort of an unpleasant experience, like emotionally. Nevertheless, I do find it intriguing that Burgess, his original novel, actually had a very different ending than the one people have come to know. And I believe his publishers made him rewrite it, and then that version was made into the Kubrick film, which then became this international sensation. But eventually his original ending was re-released or republished, and I know he wrote a notable foreword for it where he talked about we can change what has been written, but we can't unwrite it, or something like that. He essentially made reference to what had happened. So yes, for anyone interested in these things, and for a tiny bit of self-promotion, I did a watch-along for a Japanese show called Antiquarian Bookshop Biblia, where it explores the histories of books and copies of books and the human stories that lie in those novels and copies of them. And one episode is dedicated entirely to A Clockwork Orange. So yes, if you're interested in that, I would say maybe check it out. I think it's episode 5. I'll check when I post this, and I'll put it in the video description. In any case, the point is, apparently this was done for a larger project for a stage version of A Clockwork Orange, but this was the only track that was ever released publicly. So yes, I'm keen to hear what I would expect maybe to be more in soundtrack or score vein rather than pop rock or art rock or blues rock, some of the other styles I've heard U2 do up until this point. And I do wonder what other tracks they may have worked on that were eventually, kept on the shelf, if you will. But the song is titled Alex Descends into Hell for a Bottle of Milk / Korova, and Alex being the protagonist. I mean, he is the protagonist of the story, certainly one who has a complicated morality. And of course, that's sort of the point of the story overall, that if you force someone to behave in a moral manner, does it really mean the same thing as if they were actively making choices that were more, let's say, moral and respectable? Or is forcing people to be good an immoral act in itself, and ultimately not one conducive to what we would call ethical behavior to begin with? So yes, I get the significance philosophically of the novel and the story more broadly. It's just always something that's like an intense experience, whether you're talking about the novel or the movie. But I'm curious to hear what Bono and The Edge will do with this, so let's give it a listen. This is U2. The track is Alex Descends into Hell for a Bottle of Milk / Korova, and it's apparently from 1991. And as I said, it was done for a stage production of A Clockwork Orange. fascinating. So I feel like it was somewhere in between. Definitely more of a score feel, and there were sonic layers like that deep, like pad bass line, the angelic, I think, boys choir type of vocals. But we also had this like characteristic or vintage shimmering edge guitar for a lot of the tune. Now the back minute or two, like the latter stages of the track, had almost like this, industrial is too strong, but like this alternative electronica type of sound. There was that electric bass that was phasing in and phasing out, and the like heavy syncopated percussion had a bit of a like industrial or alternative type of scheme to it. And yeah, so definitely not like a pop or, what's the right word again, like art rock type of tune, but not fully score either. And maybe it's because of the guitar that I say that. Indeed, it wasn't just that shimmering edge guitar, but there were some, more electric type of chords along the way. So I found myself thinking about the world in which the novel is set. And I think that now I'm recalling, I think the production was going to be like A Clockwork Orange 2004 or something. So again, in 91, it's still extrapolating forward, though it is the kind of forward extrapolation where it's not too far away. So again, if you write something that's, a future dystopia or something like that, and it's decades away from what you're currently in time-wise, then of course, you can more accept the fictional reality. But when you write it, I guess admittedly the novel was what, the early 70s, do I have that right? So 2004 would have been farther away, whereas 91, it's like, it's not so far away that you could conceive of massive differences in society and culture, but maybe that in itself could have been a point that, are we really so far away from something like this? So yeah, ultimately it made me think about a like dystopian and like super saturated culturally, physically, in terms of the spatial environment, the societal environment. So I was like thinking of scenes from the novel, but maybe in the context of, the 90s versus the early 2000s. So I certainly was immersed in the idea of the story. I don't quite know, how to think about this in terms of what other tracks they may have made, and were they all sort of in this vein, or were there some that were more, let's say, wheelhouse U2, which of course, by the time you've gotten now to the late 80s with Rattle and Hum, and then into the early 90s as we're on the cusp of hearing what I understand to be a notable shift, Achtung Baby, like, what is their center lane of musical stylings is in flux, it's dynamic, it's evolving. But yes, ultimately, I found this very cinematic, and I was very immersed in the sonic stylings. I just don't know quite how to think about it in terms of what a full soundtrack from them might have sounded like. But definitely a cool tune, definitely one with, again, different sonic layers at the bottom, in the middle, and at the top of the track. I did really enjoy that, again, like boys choir type vocal. It had a contrast to the heavier and more alternative / industrial sonics that characterized the rest of the tune, like in terms of time and in terms of musical space, the sound sphere. So in any case, thank you again to Christian. Shout out to Izzy, who again has given me some insight about what to maybe think about in advance of going through Achtung Baby. In no sense, giving me too much information, but just giving me like concepts to think about as we go into that album. Shout out, of course, to Adam, who's been providing the YouTube material, and to Mr. Solo, who provided a lot of it prior to that. In any case, let me know what you think, and I will see you next time. Peace.